Hi, this is Paul. During Jordan's convalescence, it seems that they are trying to promote Peterson Academy, and I noticed a few days ago, a few days after it popped up, they are putting Jordan, they're at least released lecture one of Maps of Meaning, sort of where the whole thing got going.
There are forces behind the scenes.
And I got to fix the sound, also where the whole thing got going. Okay, try again.
That are moving you. You have no idea what they are. The primary cry of our time is for a uniting narrative. Heroes.
Now this is a lot fancier than it used to be. I thought about it would be sort of fun to compare Maps of Meaning Lecture 1 on the Peterson Academy with, after I'd found a few clips at that time in 2017, everybody was making all these clips of Jordan Peterson, and I'd seen a few clips, and then I thought, I want to go see what he's really doing, and I started watching Maps of Meaning, like many of you.
True around 1984, but it was true before that too. Every generation has its worries, real or imagined, and the primary worry for people of my generation was nuclear war. And, it was a genuine worry. At one point, many years later, I went down to Arizona to visit an ICBM, a decommissioned ICBM nuclear missile silo. And the ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, were very large rockets, right? They could fly halfway around the world. And it was deep underground and behind very, very thick steel doors. It was light green, that pastel green that everyone seemed to like in the 1950s. It was like pastel green Star Trek console. That's what it looked like. And so we went down out in the yard. It was in the desert. Out in the yard, there was a very, I would say, magical object, for lack of a better word. And that was the nose cone for the ICBM. And it was quite big, about that high, pointed like the point of a bullet, about 3/4 of an inch thick plastic, a kind of a resin. And it was designed to melt on re-entry. So that was just sitting there. So that was fairly thought-provoking, let's put it that way. And then we went into the missile silo. Interestingly enough, appended to the front of it, it had been decommissioned under Reagan, by the way. In the front of it, there was a museum with artifacts from the 1980s featuring Reagan and Gorbachev meeting multiple times. And it was staffed by these Americans from the South who were
I can watch the 2017 version really easily. The other guy's like, and 8 years, his own status rocket ride. So apocalyptic. We are living in a time of great transition. We are living in a time of wars and rumors of wars, and it occurred to me, I've been thinking about well, I'll say a couple other things about Peterson before we go to the next. So then I was curious because YouTube has these like combined things now, and or collaboration things. And so then I thought, I saw the PA. So I thought, Peterson Academy must have its own little thing, and so it does. And I guess there's a Peterson Academy Black Friday offer where you can get $200 off, and so you can get it for $349 a year, which it's not a bad price. It's a lot of video watching. I don't know. There was a guy who was go away. There was a guy who was doing a YouTube channel, and he was reviewing some of the classes at Peterson Academy. But again, it's interesting because I don't know if they ever got the accreditation thing figured out, or if it's just sort of like masterclass. So deal ends, save on $200. Deal ends 8 days, 23 hours, yada yada yada. So, but it's watching videos, and I already watch videos. I mean, but I've been thinking about Peter Thiel's use of the Bible compared to Jordan Peterson's, and because neither Thiel nor Peterson really use the Bible in a way that, how did Doug Wilson say it to Sam Harris? Yeah, here it is.
Yeah, that's great. I would consider myself a fundamentalist in the sense of believing the fundamentals of the Christian faith. I believe the Apostles' Creed, in other words. And I believe it in the sense that it was held when it was first handed down. But fundamentalist has also taken on cultural significance. So, like a fundamentalist is someone wears a black skinny necktie and is a King James version only guy, and that sort of thing. That's sort of a cultural phenomenon. And I'm not necessarily a fundamentalist in that sense, but I do believe the fundamentals of the Christian faith. I would describe myself as a biblical absolutist, which is not the same thing as taking the Bible literally. A biblical absolutist is someone who would take the Bible naturally, taking it the way it presents itself to be taken. So when Luke writes his gospel and he says at the beginning, I interviewed a bunch of eyewitnesses and I wrote it down carefully, he's presenting it as sober history. So I take it as sober history. Psalms that are poetry present themselves as poetry. I take it as poetry.
So it's interesting how everybody sort of backs away from a lot of people back away from the literally thing, including Doug Wilson, interestingly enough. He chooses naturally. And when you get to the Gospels, these are eyewitness accounts. You could read Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. It's a very interesting book if you're interested in that. C.S. Lewis, of course, commented about the genre of the Gospels being so surprising compared to a lot of the other contemporary genres that were out there. But when it comes to apocalyptic, when it comes to big things, how does one describe it? Now, actually, one of the parts that I liked about his talk with Sam Harris, which seemed to just go right over Sam Harris's head.
Testament first. And if the New Testament repeats something from the Old Testament, then okay, that's obligatory. Right. But they're New Testament centered.
Okay, so just to get my bearings here, so how old do you think the universe is based on your reading of the Bible or any other stream of information?
Yeah, based on my rudimentary math skills, the world is about 6,000 years old.
Okay, so
I'm a young Earth. Yeah, so I'm a young Earth creationist.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. So anyone kind of coming at this from the outside, from secular society, trying to fit you in the canonical debates around the collision between science and religion and evolutionary biology and Christian theology understands which side of that argument you're on.
Right. I'm an anti-Darwinist, young Earth creationist.
Right.
Having said that, and I know that many of your viewers and people who follow you and have read your stuff are going to park me right next to the flat Earth guys, because of that statement of how old the world is. But one of the things that I would just point out in passing is when people say that the universe, the cosmos, is 14 billion years old, or whatever the current number is, they are presupposing a Newtonian balcony somewhere that they get to stand on to watch the whole thing. And one of the things that...
Which I really appreciated him sort of pivoting with that point. I'm not a young Earth creationist, but his point about an observer, again, I think is a really good one. And again, I'll mention Spencer Klavin's newest book on that. Part of what I contemplate, especially this time of year, we are coming towards Thanksgiving, and in the church calendar, Advent is coming up quite quickly, the Advent season. And in the Advent season, it's a fasting season in anticipation. You'll be hearing, if you catch the Living Stones live stream, I'm sure you hear, O come, Emmanuel, sung more than once during Advent. We usually sing it a few times. But liturgically, we begin to move into the time of Advent as a fasting season in anticipation of Christmas, which is a feasting season. And we get to think about comings. And part of the strangeness of the Christian story is, of course, the coming and appearance of Jesus. And you'll have the stories of of Bethlehem and the manger and the angels and the magi. But the strangest thing, of course, the thing that continues to be tremendously controversial is our thoughts of not only the incarnation, but the audacity of the God of Israel coming to her. And that's, of course, just something to just try to get your head around. Because when we think about, let's say, the God of Israel coming to her, one of my favorite Psalms, Psalm 18, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, my deliverance. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I called on the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I have been saved from my enemies. The cords of death entangled me, the torrents of destruction overwhelmed me, the cords of the grave coiled around me, and the snares of death confronted me. In my men's group, we're reading through the book of Samuel, came across this in Samuel 22. It's a great psalm. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. And this is just imagistically just creates this. And we can see it through, how many different movies or imaginations or illustrations that you see little David down on the earth and the Lord on his throne in this temple above the heavens, and he hears him. And it's almost, Superman hearing Lois Lane or something, and from his fortress of solitude, and he's going to rend the skies and come to him. Or, there's this scene, I think, in the second Matrix movie where Neo he has to get from one place. He's fighting all these dudes, and then he goes out this door, and he's like halfway around the world from the city, and he has to fly all the way back to the city to save his friends. Just look at the imagery here. The imagery is amazing. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountain shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. I love that verse because what is he, a dragon? Rose from his, but it's so evocative. And you'd see this in cartoons as a kid. If you watch Looney Tunes and Bug Bunny, somebody gets really angry, or a bull. I think they had a bull, and one gets really angry, and it's like smoke comes from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. He parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him. It's a great image in Kings when the cloud of the Lord comes upon the temple and the priests have to move out. And, there's this comment that the Lord dwells in darkness. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced with hailstones and bolts of lightning. The Lord thundered from heaven. The voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning, he routed them. The valleys of the seas were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare. At your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of your breath from your nostrils, he reached down on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes whom were too strong for me. They confronted me on the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out into a spacious place, and he rescued me because he delighted in me. Amazing poem, amazing imagery. Jonathan Peugeot recently did a video on exaggeration in storytelling, which is a very interesting video. Listen to it on the plane today.
These kind of haunting stories that exist in the United States. And so I watched the movie, and I knew that it was kind of based on true stories. But one of the things I noticed in the movie, and this is really what I want to talk about, is the way in which the story was exaggerated. And so, in the movie, things get really wild, and so all kinds of crazy things happen. Women get dragged on their feet on the floor with their hair. Chairs float in the air, and beds shake, and people get bruised, and there's all of this. There's a lot of these things happen, and these visions and these creatures appear, and all of it, and it's really quite excessive. So it made me kind of curious to read the more historical accounts of some of these stories. And so I looked into the story of Annabelle, and I saw how in the story of Annabelle, they found these scribbled notes about this doll that is supposed to be possessed, and people would wake up in the morning with scratches on their hands, and there were these kind of poltergeist type activities where things would move, and there would be doors opening, but obviously nowhere near the kind of craziness that you see in the movie, where things float upside down and all kinds of excessive things. And it made me meditate a little bit about why it is that when they tell the version in the movie, why they tell it the way they do. Why is it that in movies there's a kind of dramatization of events that happen in life, why that's necessary, why in some ways it is inevitable. And then also, I want to help you understand how sometimes, although it is inevitable, it's important that this kind of process happens, that sometimes this can be weaponized against us.
All right, so there's the kickoff to the movie. I'll put the link below to it. Now, Doug Wilson talks about, the Gospels. These are eyewitness accounts. They're stories of, obviously there's miracle stories, but if you read, let's say, the Gospels, and then you read the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel, well, it's very different. And then you read Psalm 18, and we would imagine, let's say, the natural way that Doug Wilson is talking about, that David is fleeing from his enemies, he's fighting his enemies, he's doing all this stuff that David did. And if you read the book of Samuel, I mean, there's a tremendous amount of material on David in the Old Testament, a tremendous amount compared to just about anyone else in the Old Testament. I mean, even Moses, when you just look at narrative, I mean, the Mosaic books are full of codes, and there's a lot of stories of Moses, but David could be the number one storied person in the Old Testament. I don't know, I haven't done a statistical analysis, but there's a ton of material on David. And he's hiding in the desert from Saul, he's going into battle, he's fighting a war, he's doing all of this stuff. And again, we'll use Wilson's word, naturally, I'd say just prosaically. But then how does it feel to David? Well, in many ways, that's sort of where the Psalms come in, because the Psalm is this amazing, imagistic telling of sort of God as superhero leaving his fortress of solitude up above the dome of the earth and rending open the heavens and coming down to save his beloved. And it's a powerful and beautiful psalm, but we understand what it's doing. part of what's been interesting in I think there's so at the end, obviously at the end of the story of Jesus at the ascension, the angels come down and tell the apostles he's going to return in the same way he left. Okay. But even for a very long time, there's been a lot of fascination about that. How does that work? And then once you get sort of in this apocalyptic imaginary, it's really difficult, because if you read the book of Daniel, certain other portions of the Old Testament prophets, and definitely the book of Revelation, it's in some ways much more like Psalm 18 in some sense than it is like the Gospels. And Christians, now let's bring this word literal back in, or maybe we should say literarily, because Christians, we are so steeped on the book that we look at these stories. Well, how do we imagine them? Again, dreams aren't bad analogies for the slipperiness of perception, because when we're having a dream, and again, it isn't even the right word, watching a dream. We sort of watch a dream, but that's not the word we use. We use the word when we're having a dream, because dreams are things that we participate in. It's not usually like watching a movie, something on a screen that's separate from us. It's something that we're living and we're doing and we're participating. But dreams are very strange in that, on one hand, they don't necessarily feel abnormal unless something sort of surprises us or catches us. And usually that's let's say we're started coming out of our dream, and then we, the world that we live in during our waking hours sort of begins to impinge on us. And even if you look at all the cog sci in relationship to the strangeness of the world that we live in, because according to all the cog sci, this sort of simplistic, naive imagining of the straightforwardness of it has really been severely undermined. We see what we expect to see.
So what's going on here? Now, what Carl Frisson came up with, and other people like Andy Clark, my former student and colleague Mark Miller, is the idea the brain doesn't actually try to predict the world. And this is the first doorway to spirit. What? Hang with me. Brain doesn't try to predict the world. That's too complex for any machine. The brain tries to predict your body interacting with the world. So let me give you an example. I don't have to go to retina school. I don't have to do anything to learn to use my retina. All I have to do is open my eyes, light hits my retina, and there's patterns of nerve firing. Yeah? No, do you get that those patterns change as I move around? That's a sensory motor pattern. There's patterns happening on the retina. So this level right here. I suppose I should do this. Okay, this part directly interacting with the world. No learning required there. And patterns are happening here. Now, what you have is you have a brain level just above that. And what it's trying to do is it's trying to detect patterns in here and complete them ahead of time. It's just trying to figure out this is what the pattern's going to be. Now, because this isn't the world, because the world isn't trying to help you. That's why trying to predict the world is really hard. But this part of the brain and this part of the brain, they belong together. And so this part can try and say, I think you're going to do that pattern. And this part can give it feedback and say, yeah, you got it right, or no, you got it wrong. Pretty easy. Now, If I try to walk a little bit faster than that across the stage, the sensory motor loop is too slow for me to do it. I can't do it.
And so is
I would
Chad.
rely on the information to go down and come out. It's too fast. I bet you've all run faster than that, yeah? What happens is the cerebellum tries to pick up on patterns in the sensory motor patterns in my eyes, my legs, tries to detect patterns and complete them ahead of time. And that's how I can do that. You understand? Does that make sense? It's detecting and completing patterns. Here's another one. This one will get creepier. So look at this. Look at this. You see that color? Yeah? How many of you can see the color? How many of you can see the whole color of the whole wall? Okay, your eye can't do that. Your eye can't subtend all of that. What happens is your eye is picking up on little patches, and then a higher level in the brain is trying to detect and complete a pattern. So now I'm going to say something that I hope lands for you. You're mostly imagining that wall. You're mostly imagining the floor. As soon as I say that, it sounds like, and some people use, I hate this, it's a controlled hallucination. You know the defining feature of hallucinations? They're false. This isn't false. You know what an important property of predictions are? They can be true. True prediction. Okay? So we need, and so Henri Corbin came up with a really powerful distinction between the imaginary. So imagine a sailboat in your mind. Can you do it? Picture in your head. Are the sails up or down? Put your hands up if they were up or down. There you go. Okay. Form a little picture and la, 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 la. Turns out that's not very important, even though that's what we think imagination is about. How do we know it's not important? There's at least 5 to 10% of the population cannot do that. And they don't suffer at all. Now, that's imaginary. I want you to compare to a kid who's putting out their arms, ties a little blanket around them and goes, "Shh, I'm Superman." They're not forming a picture of Superman. They're trying to see and be in the world the way Superman is. Do you see the difference? Everybody does that. Because that's very important. That's indispensable to cognition. I'm going to show you that. What I'm trying to show you is your experience is already deeply imaginal. So what the European Enlightenment gave us this idea that there's reality. You got to hit surfaces very hard when you do that. And then there's the imagination. And here's the scientist. And here's the romantic poet. And that's pretty much all bullshit. Okay? These dichotomies, if I can do one thing here, I want to smash the dichotomies. Okay, so right from the beginning.
All right, maybe you can understand why I'm doing this with Psalm 18 and with the apocalyptic and with the way, so back to Peterson. Peterson there and Peterson there for all of the changes in his life. One of the things that hasn't changed, I don't think, is how he understands the Bible. Now, I spent a lot of time in those early years listening very carefully to him, trying to understand how he understands the Bible. And a good book that I've talked about through my entire time making videos is C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles, because there are passages in that book where Lewis deals with many of these questions of perception, these questions of description and perception. And Lewis hones in on the ascension and Jesus sitting at the right hand of God, and he hones in on miracles of the old creation and miracles of the new creation. And I should probably read the book again, because I've mined and horrid red things. I mean, all of these things that Lewis works in his book Miracles. One of the things that I see so I spent a lot of time trying to figure out Peterson. And Peterson's, because one of the things that happened, the reason I got going on Peterson back in 2017, when he was releasing these lectures and I was listening to them, was he was using the Bible differently than, I'd say, most Christians in church, including myself. I think even though I had plenty of training, I understood poetry as in Psalm 18, I understood apocalyptic literature, there was a degree to which I think from a very early age, at a very deep level, I would understand things like the book of Revelation sort of like a comic book or an animated something. I wouldn't really understand it, and that could just very well be because in the 60s and 70s when I'm growing up, and there might be little attempts to try to visualize this, and because many attempts to sort of draw the book of Revelation fails, because it's Revelation singular, it's the revelation of Jesus Christ. Many attempts to draw the Apocalypse of St. John, another name for the book of Revelation, they fail because there's a really interesting, I preached through the book of Revelation not too long ago. There's a really interesting dynamic in that book where the described vision is more like a dream than something you can illustrate. And this is, of course, and you can see this to a degree in something like Psalm 18, because we would imagine that David is, out there fighting hand to hand, killing someone, running for his life. And this is the poetry that comes out of it. You'll get this interesting Psalm 2 in the second chapter of the book of Jonah. And there's a lot of discussion. Jonah, of course, is thrown into the sea, and then he's sort of at the bottom of the sea. And there's a lot of discussion is, okay, well, is Jonah dead? Is there sort of a resurrection in that story? I mean, how does this work? And you can, part of what's interesting about film is that film often is created from storyboards, because if you just want to go from sort of imagining it in my head like that sailboat, well, how much detail? Because when you say sailboat, just sort of just a flash in my head of a picture of a sailboat, and then he asks a detail question: are the sails up or down? And they were just up. And for me, in many ways, the sailboat is sort of a collection of shapes, and so I just imagine this triangular sail. But if you would begin to ask more detailed questions, I would probably make up those answers as I went along. And you can see that when you attempt, let's say, to draw something, unless you're a very good illustrator. When you draw something, you begin to realize that, oh, I don't really know how to do that. Peterson used to use the example of a helicopter, because you would say, well, what's a helicopter? Oh, I know what a helicopter looks like. Okay, well, sit down with a pen and paper and draw one. And you very quickly begin to realize there's a lot more about that helicopter that you don't really know. And that then gets into some of what, Vervaeke is talking about in terms of this deep prediction of patterns that we're doing inside. Now, for Peterson, again, this is review of lots of stuff that I used to talk about a lot when I was kind of working through his stuff, trying to figure out his stuff. for Peterson, the Bible is true in many ways because in the same way that literature is true. And you can hear him talking about that in that video with Jonathan Peugeot and Doug Murray.
All the time. How do you orient yourself to do that? And so and I don't think that first of all, the atheist types can't respond to that because there's no way that they can produce an ethic on the fly in some sense. And that was Hume's objection. And it also, thinking about the problem this way, see, it also opens the door to a deeper understanding of the role that fiction and mythology play, because you can think of fiction, including mythology, as a form of abstraction that characterizes patterns of behavior and action, rather than a form of abstraction that describes the world the way science does. And that way, fiction becomes a different kind of truth, which is a pragmatic truth rather than a descriptive or propositional truth. And it's oriented towards ethics and the direction of attention. And so I'm increasingly thinking about the heavenly hierarchy as a internal, in some sense, psychological structure through which we see the world. And I'll add one more thing to that and turn it over to Jonathan. The other thing that strikes me as psychologically unassailable is the fact that you need a uniting principle to orient your perceptions and actions toward for two fundamental reasons, three fundamental reasons. One is, if you're aiming towards something valuable, that gives you positive emotion and hope. And so all the motivation that goes along with that, it fills you with enthusiasm. Second, if you don't have a uniting ethic that governs your own perceptions and actions, then you're confused and in disarray. And the cost of that is anxiety and hopelessness and pain and frustration and disappointment and grief, all of the negative emotions. And then third, if you don't have a uniting ethic, and so that has to be united under something like a monotheistic superordinate entity, if you don't have that, then you have social disarray because there's nothing that unites people in their common ethical pursuit, and that's their behavior and their perceptions. And so I'll let Jonathan comment on that a bit.
No, I think what you're saying is right on track. That is, one of the problems that happened in the story of Christianity is something like the Enlightenment and modernism, which is that as the world was moving towards this notion of mechanical causation and the interest in mechanical causation, there came to be a misunderstanding of the way that traditional Christians believed the world actually existed. So there's a difference between the material causes and something like the vertical cause of something. And the vertical cause of something is exactly this hierarchy that Jordan is talking about. And I would push what Jordan is saying even further. That is, it does actually affect, to a certain extent, even the is, because we can't perceive an is without a hierarchy of attention and without a hierarchy of perception, because the world is indefinite in detail and in quantity. And so for even to be able to say this, to point to something, to say that, is already in this hierarchy of something we could call vertical causation. So this glass has millions and millions of aspects to it, but we nonetheless are able to see it as one. And the fact that we see it as one is a total mystery to scientists. They don't know how to account for it. They use words like emergence, and you could just use the word magic and it would be the same. Like this jump into unity. That is the type of causation that we talk about when we talk about religious causation.
Well, that unity that you discuss in relationship to the glass is a pragmatic unity, because
it's a unity of good.
That's also a unity of good. Well, then you think, well,
it's an ethical, in a general, very general sense, it's an ethical unity, because
it is an ethical unity. Well, I would say in a specific sense, because if you were a photorealist painter, you could spend a month painting all the reflections on that glass. It's a very complex thing to perceive, but you perceive it as a unity. And we know this neuropsychologically. We know this scientifically. You perceive it as a unity because you can grip it, and because you can raise it to your lips, and because you can drink it, and because you need to drink water to survive. And you are willing to drink water to survive because you believe emotionally and motivationally and perhaps rationally that survival is a good, and that's dependent on your belief that human existence in some sense is a good, and that it's striving towards some sort of higher unified order. And you might think, well, you don't need all that to perceive the glass. And the answer is, yeah, as a matter of fact, you need all of that to perceive the glass. And if you lose some of that because of various forms of cortical damage, let's say, you enter into the realm of all sorts of bizarre blindnesses. And so that point you make about the is being dependent on the ought is also extremely interesting, because if the world is infinitely complex, which seems to be the case or close enough, the hierarchy of attention you bring to bear on it, and so your intent, determines in no small part the array of manifestations that infinity will produce in your field of apprehension. And that does determine to some degree at least what elements of the object you have access to, and then manipulate and then bring into being. I've been thinking about objects too as this, so they have this reality surrounded by a field of possibility, right? And so the object isn't just what it is, it's also a set of things that it could become with varying degrees of difficulty depending on your intent. So it's a combination of being and becoming.
Could become a weapon, but it couldn't become a car.
Right.
So it has an identity, but it's also surrounded by a field of possibilities. That's a good way to talk about it.
Right.
And so the point is that when we look at the way that the creation of the world is described in Genesis, it's related exactly to that. God creates something, sees it, and sees that it's good. And so there's this notion of apprehension of identities and realizing that those identities have to do with the fact that they're bound up in a value judgment, even though it's not necessarily moral. It's just a value judgment about how good something is. Because if I see a glass, I am always asking, is it a good glass? Even if I don't do it consciously, necessarily, because I know that it's there to grip and to drink from. And it's the same, even scientists are doing that because they have to focus their attention on something because they can't study everything at once. They have to decide, I'm going to study this, and I'm going to decide the reason why I study that, and therefore I'm going to be able to identify the facts that fit with my theory and prove my theory. So even the scientist is moving in this type of perception of the world, even sometimes without realizing it.
And this also works in our texts and how we apprehend them. And so Peterson winds up, while his wife becomes Roman Catholic, his daughter becomes an evangelical, and Peterson sort of stays out of it. And part of this, when I was looking at how Peterson read the Bible, you could see that he didn't sort of read it in the child storybook way that, let's say, I am formed and accustomed to reading the Bible. For Peterson, the Bible is apologetically, I was enculturated to see the proof of the Bible in terms of, okay, well, in my mind, there's a correspondence between the pictures in the storybook and 2,000 years ago, remember Doug Wilson's Newtonian porch. I often call it the monarchical vision. That Newtonian porch where I could sort of hover over Palestine, over Judea and the Galilee, and watch these things happen. And part of the reason that this is so powerful for us is that we almost can not make these, the Jesus movie or The Chosen. I mean, we just have to try to want to be there, but we forget that we are seeing it through a camera and a cinematographer and a director and a storyboard. And the fact that we're always doing this storyboarding as we walk through the world, we forget that. Because to remember that would be completely wrong, and it would impede us and it would disable us. But we're constantly doing that storyboarding, and even an object, a fact. You know, you might say this lens cap is a fact. I recently found the old Thiel cell phone stand. But, you know, the old way of imagining, you know, would say, well, we're going to build our life on first principles. And we imagine there, again, back to stuff I used to talk about a lot, Amazon boxes or things like this. We're going to build our life upon facts. But, you know, what Peugeot and Vervaeke and Peterson are talking about is that this gets storyboarded in my mind, in a sense, predictively, as John notes. And, you know, and then when Alex O'Connor asked Jordan, that meeting when, you know, good conversation that Jordan had with Alex O'Connor, you know, if there's a video camera, well, where would that video camera be? And you see, you can't even delve into that. Now, in some sense, it's sort of common sense. You get into common sense realism, sort of common sense. You just drop in and you imagine. But again, the difficulty, of course, is that life doesn't work that way unless you're naturally, we'll use that word that Doug Wilson used, you're naturally right there. Because, you know, it could be that you know, if ever if I go someplace and I don't know any, the thing was my wife would, you know, before she was more used to me traveling around and meeting total strangers and doing things in a lot of different places. That has been the case for the last few years. You know, what if this person is an axe murderer? You know, there could be an axe murderer sneaking up behind me. They'd have to be very skillful because I'm looking at this camera and the camera is looking behind me. The camera is looking behind me. There'd have to be this axe murderer, and this axe murderer would then, you know, kill me with an axe, as if, you know, you've got people walking around the street with these, you know, giant battle axes and sneaking up to. Anyway, so you get into this question of how does the Bible relate to the world? And one of the things that I'm seeing both with Peterson, now Peugeot, of course, was raised a Christian, and so I would imagine Peugeot has developed a very sophisticated understanding of all of this, and you can see that in his talk here. But, you know, one of the things that really struck me too is that whenever you would see apologists argue for the truth of the resurrection, it was always in sort of that imagined naturalistic way. And that's probably a better way to say it. Imagined naturalistic, because we're thinking of naturalism and we're thinking about concordance. And so what if...
But it's an important question to ask.
No, of course. It's a very good objection. So I just did a seminar on the Gospels with a crew of about 8 people. And it was the same crew that walked through Exodus with me with a couple of variations.
I don't know why they're not releasing that to the main channel. They did it with the Exodus series. Why are they holding the Gospel series behind the paywall? I don't know.
And we spent a lot of time on the resurrection accounts, for example. And of course, that was the toughest, morsel to chew and digest. The thing about the resurrection accounts is that they're all, look, so I could say something like this, which will just annoy people, but it doesn't matter. I believe the accounts, but I have no idea what they mean.
When you say you believe the accounts, do you mean, and I hate to be sort of pedantic here, it seems pedantic, but do you mean you believe that these are things that happened such that that's a strange I know you don't like that. Let me put it this way.
See, O'Connor is getting into the naturalistic, which is fine. I mean, that's how we're living. That's what we're living. If there's a crime, that's exactly what the police would ask me for. Now, again, there's physical evidence and then there's witness testimony, and witness testimony is tricky, even when people are being completely truthful. And the more you understand the complexities of cognition, the complexities of apprehension, perhaps the better you can understand why eyewitness testimony is both extremely compelling, but also a little bit more slippery than we imagine.
If I went back in time with a Panasonic video camera and put that camera in front.
And what's amazing about this little story that we tell is sort of like the movies, we're agreeing to sort of, withhold judgment on if I went back in time. Oh, so you're asking me about the resurrection, but you're wanting me to just for the sake of the argument, imagine you going back in time. Because we actually have zero idea of what going back in time would involve. And every now and then you'll see movies, they'll play with this a little bit because, of course, you're going to go back in time. And then and then we have like Star Trek transporters. Will you materialize? But what if you get materialized in a rock or a pillar or just, three, if you get materialized 10 feet above the ground, you're going to fall. And of course, movie-wise, we always get materialized exactly at the appropriate elevation, because again, and you can begin to see the problem that if I go back in time
to the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, would the little LCD screen show a man walk out of that tomb?
I would suspect yes.
So that to me seems like a belief in the historical event of the resurrection.
And again, now suddenly you're trying to find words that come to mind to say, okay, the historical event. But now when you're saying that word historical, you have to understand historiography and what historical has come to mean over the last 500 years. There's a correspondentism. And again, you can use naturally. And again, naturally is sort of that word nature is a very complex word. In terms of its history too, physics. I mean, Lewis goes into that a bit in Miracles as well, because what we're packing into that word is something like what I will experience when I finish this video and when I lock up the office and when I get in my car and when I drive home. Even though, you know how much stuff is packed into that? You know how easy, and if you work with older people, you begin to realize just how many little things go wrong, and I can't manage what I just talked about, which I do every day naturally. So there's so much going on here, and again, what's really frustrated people about Peterson, but I respect him for it, is his willingness, and there's plenty of videos where he's not consistent with this, and we saw that especially in the Jubilee things where he's changing his, and there's a lot going on there. But when it comes to things like Psalm 18 and David being rescued and our use of language, and we're just so adept at this. We do it naturally, but we do it naturally. I don't use that word, but we don't appreciate everything that goes into it. Just like I can think of some people that I love, members of my church, who right now they've been disabled by a stroke, or they're just shut in because of old age or what have you, but they can't naturally do any of the things that I do without any effort at all. I will go home, I will see my wife, I will eat dinner, we'll do something tonight. I mean, all of these things that there are people that used to do these things effortlessly, and now they couldn't do them no matter how hard they tried, because they're disabled by a stroke, or they're just near death, or something of that nature. So Peter Thiel has been famously doing some private Antichrist lectures, and that has hit the news. There's a Washington Post podcast. I guess someone sent them a bootleg copy of it, but he has also been making videos about that. He did a Ross Douthat conversation, which I covered, and there's quite a bit more detailed conversation on the Hoover Institute. And part of the response to Thiel's Antichrist lectures is super interesting because on one hand, it's like, why would you talk about this? Where apparently there's a long tradition of people talking about this.
That it is the duty, that's a quote from Newman, the duty of believers, quote, ever to be watching for the end times, quote, and above all, to keep in mind the great and awful sign of which St. Paul speaks to the Thessalonians, the emergence of, quote, the very image of Satan, the fearful and hateful Antichrist, close quote. As I understand your argument, you hold, one, that the prophecy of an Antichrist in one way or another remains valid, or at least useful. Two, that it remains our duty, again, Cardinal Newman's word, duty, to watch for the signs that it might emerge. And three, that duty is now almost entirely neglected and forgotten. Fair?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
tell us. Go ahead.
I mean, yeah. There's so many, there's so many different things one can say about it. There's a, I think it was Ivan Illich who said that before, in the time before Christ, there were many forerunners to Christ. In the time after Christ, there will be many forerunners of the Antichrist. So, in some sense, it's a type. So Nero was a type of the Antichrist, or maybe Napoleon was a type of the Antichrist, and it's sort of a, it's someone who aspires for world domination, creation of this sort of one world state. In some ways, Alexander the Great was sort of a pre-Christ prototype of the Antichrist. It's sort of very parallel to Christ. They both die at 33. Alexander conquers the world. Christ saves it. So sort of a compare and contrast. So, but in some sense, the Antichrist as an idea is something that really comes into being in the world after Christ. And so there's, and then there's a lot of things about it that are mysterious. In some ways, the Antichrist copies Christ. The Antichrist pretends to be greater than Christ, hyper-Christian, ultra-Christian, and then maybe only ultimately, deeply, deeply anti-Christian.
Okay, so you
and then
go ahead,
and then you can think of it as a system, where maybe communism is a one-world system. So it can be an ideology or a system. And then of course you can also think of it as Newman did, where it's sort of the final dictator of the one world state, where it's still, you stress it more as a person. You can think of it as a type, a system, a person. It has something to do in this post-Christian. It's something that's sort of a possibility in this post-Christian world. It is in some ways, and it's related to Christ in a very complicated way. So, the theological question you can always ask, is it possible to be too Christian? And in theory, no. But, in practice, if you think you're more Christian than Christ, you're in trouble.
Okay, so there's a deep, 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 fascinating weirdness to this whole thing. Let me just say that right off the bat. There's a deep, fascinating weirdness to this whole thing. That you have a billionaire who made his money first in PayPal, in Facebook, and now Palantir, which is, of course, named after the Seeing Stones in the Lord of the Rings to I don't know exactly what Palantir does. I've seen some videos on it, but apparently they somehow mine the internet for intelligence data to give to states for I don't know what. So that's this guy. And these videos are a year ago, and he's going around giving private lectures on the Antichrist. So Peterson, again, when I found Peterson in 2017, Peterson then, of course, started doing his biblical series. Now, May 16, this was about exactly maybe it was April. I don't know when I first found Peterson, but I remember I'd seen some things. I don't remember what I saw. I saw some clips first, and then he starts doing this, and at this point it was like, I want to talk to somebody about this, because I just can't think about this myself, because it's not how I work. I've got to talk to somebody about it. So,
well, thank you all very much for coming. It's really shocking to me that you don't have anything better to do on a Tuesday night. No, seriously though, it is. I mean, it's very strange in some sense that there's so many of you here to listen to a sequence of lectures on the psychological significance of the biblical stories. It isn't something I've wanted to do for a long time, but it still does surprise me that there's a...
And of course, it's really funny because he couldn't have done it until the whole C16 thing, until the whole... all of the... I mean, he had been on Canadian public TV plenty, and he was a favored professor and all those things, but not until his fame had reached a certain point, it's sort of like then the next level of the status rocket engages and, pushes him far higher. And these lectures did.
Ready audience for it. And, well, so that's good. So we'll see how it goes. And I'll start with this, because this is the right question. The right question is, why bother doing this? And I don't mean, why should I bother doing it? I have my own reasons for doing it, but you might think, well, why bother with this strange old book at all? And that's a good question. It's a contradictory document that's been cobbled together over thousands of years. It's outlasted kingdoms, many, many kingdoms. It's really interesting that it turns out that a book is more durable than stone. It's more durable than a castle. It's more durable than an empire. And that's really interesting, that something in some sense so evanescent and be so long-living. So there's that. That's kind of a mystery. I'm approaching this whole scenario, this biblical stories, as if they're a mystery, fundamentally, because they are. There's a lot we don't understand about them. We don't understand how they came about. We don't really understand how they were put together. We don't understand why they had such an unbelievable impact on civilization. We don't understand how people could have believed them. We don't understand what it means that we don't believe them now, or even what it would mean if we did believe them. And then on top of all that...
And part of it is, one of the things I really enjoy about studying the Bible is the history of interpretation, because it is fascinating to read what other people read reading the same text. And part of what's fun about seeing some of these old videos again is I watched these videos very closely in 2017 and 2018, and I have the video record of my watching them. I mean, they're here in this massive back catalog in YouTube, and I'm playing on the Vanderclips channel, a lot of the back catalog of a lot of the conversations that many of us had back in 2018, 2019, 2020, and so forth. It's just how things change.
There's the additional problem, which isn't specific to me, but is certainly relevant to me, that no matter how educated you are, you're not educated enough to discuss the psychological significance of the biblical stories. But I'm going to do my best, and partly because I want to learn more about them. And one of the things I've learned is that the best way to learn about something is to talk about it. And when I'm lecturing, I'm thinking, I'm not trying to tell you what I know for sure to be the case, because there's lots of things I don't know for sure to be the case. I'm trying to make sense out of this, and I have been doing this for a long time. Now, you may know, you may not, that I'm an admirer of Nietzsche. Nietzsche was a devastating critic of, I would say, dogmatic Christianity as it was instantiated in institutions, I suppose, although he's a a very paradoxical thinker because, for example, one of the things Nietzsche said was that he didn't believe that the scientific revolution would have ever got off the ground if it hadn't been for Christianity, and more specifically for Catholicism, because he believed that over the course of really 1,000 years, the European mind, so to speak, had to train itself to interpret everything that was known within a single coherent framework. Coherent if you accept the initial axioms. A single coherent framework. And so Nietzsche...
Single coherent framework for the community. Because otherwise you get all of these... Oh, what was I talking to? You get all of these just... Someone was... Nick Land was just on Benjamin Boyce, and I talked to some people, and some people were like... He would come up in conversation, and some people were like, oh, don't bother with him. And another person was like, oh, you definitely need to watch him. So I don't know who Nick Land is. Don't waste your time, some people said. Oh, definitely pay attention to him. And part of it is this, our experiences are, they just poof, poof, poof. And especially religious experience, they have this experience, they have this experience, they have this experience. I was reading, I'm going to have to pick it up again, I haven't finished, Molly Worthen's Spellbound, and you just see all of these eruptions in American spiritual history of this person and that person, this person, that person. And so what happens in a church and in a community, then of course when I was talking to John Vervaeke about Hermes, I said, part of what happens in the church is that, okay, so John is having some kind of relationship with Hermes, but when you're in a Pentecostal church and everybody's having a relationship with the Holy Spirit or with Jesus, you can sort of compare notes in a way that reins in all the complexity within something and brings order and discipline, and that order and discipline is going to produce other things.
Believe that Catholicization of the phenomena of life and of history produced the kind of mind that was then capable of transcending its dogmatic foundations and then concentrating on something else, which in this particular case happened to be the natural world. And so Nietzsche believed that in some sense Christianity died at its own hand. It had spent a very long period of time trying to attune people to the necessity of the truth, absent the corruption and all of that that's always part of any human endeavor. And then the truth, the spirit of the truth that was developed by Christianity turned on the roots of Christianity, and everyone woke up and said something like, or thought something like, well, how is it that we came to believe any of this? It's like waking up one day and noting that you really don't know why you put a Christmas tree up, but you've been doing it for a long time, and that's what people do. And, there are reasons that Christmas trees came about, but the ritual lasts long after the reasons have been forgotten. So now Nietzsche, although he was a critic of Christianity and also a champion of its disciplinary capacity, because you see, the other thing that Nietzsche believed was that it was not possible to be free in some sense unless you had been a slave. And by that he meant that you don't go from childhood to full-fledged adult individuality. You go from childhood to a state of discipline, which you might think is akin to slavery, to self-imposed slavery. That would be the best scenario, where you have to discipline yourself to become something specific before you might be able to reattain the generality that you had as a child. And he believed that Christianity had played that role for Western civilization. But in the late 1800s, he announced that God was dead. And you often hear of that as something triumphant. But for Nietzsche, it wasn't, because he was too nuanced a thinker to be that simple-minded. See, Nietzsche understood that, and this is something I'm going to try to make clear, is that there's a very large amount that we don't know about the structure of experience, that we don't know about reality. And we have our articulated representations of the world. And then you could think of outside of that, there are things we know absolutely nothing about. And there's a buffer between them. And those are things we sort of know something about. And we don't know them in an articulated way. Here's an example. Sometimes you're arguing with someone close to you, and they're in a bad mood, and they're being touchy and unreasonable. And you keep the conversation up, and maybe all of a sudden they get angry, or maybe they cry. And then when they cry, they figure out what they're angry about, and it has nothing to do with you, even though you might have been what precipitated the argument, and that's an interesting phenomenon as far as I'm concerned, because it means that people can know things at one level without being able to speak what they know at another. And so in some sense, the thoughts rise up from the body, and they do that in moods, and they do that in images, and they do that in actions. And we have all sorts of ways that we understand before we understand in a fully articulated manner. And so we have this articulated space that we can all discuss. And then outside of that, we have something that's more akin to a dream we're embedded in. And it's an emotional dream that we're embedded in. And that's based, at least in part, on our actions. And I'll describe that later. And then outside of that is what we don't know anything about at all. And in that dream, that's where the mystics live, and that's where the artists live. And they're the mediators between the absolute unknown and the things we know for sure. And you see,
and that's not a bad way to imagine David fighting for his life, maybe just with one other person, and it's him or it's David or the other guy, and David prevails. And then God, who sits above the dome of the earth, and then him rending the clouds and coming down, as in Psalm 18 that we read.
First year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel had a dream. There before me was a beast, fearful, terrifying, very strong. It had great iron teeth, and it ate its victims and trampled their remains underfoot. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, we're back to St. Paul. He's writing about the end times. It cannot happen until there has appeared the wicked one, the lost one, the enemy, who raises himself above every object of worship and flaunts the claim that he is God. Revelation chapter 13. Then I saw a beast emerge from the sea. They prostrated themselves in front of the beast, saying, "Who can compare with the beast? Who can fight against it?" And all the people of the world will worship it.
Okay, now. Not only do I have my Christian formation that appropriates all of this, I also have my pastoral formation and the discipline when I look at Daniel and Thessalonians and Revelation, and especially because my pastoral, the school of biblical interpretation that was dominant when I was preparing for the ministry was the grammatical historical. And the strength of the grammatical historical is the attempt to understand meaning in grammatical context and in historical context, to the degree that we can nail down grammatical context and historical context. But while I was in seminary, one of the new wave of biblical interpretation was much more literary, which was understanding the themes between things. Now, this gets really wonky when you get into, again, a flat modernistic correspondence assumption, which has Alex O'Connor somehow traveling through time with a video camera, imagining he can stop right at that moment, at that time and place, in that Newtonian balcony with his LCD screen to capture what, frankly, none of the Gospels capture. Now, the implication is, I mean, if you read, let's say, the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, you'll have Jesus coming out of the tomb with a giant cross with a big mouth talking, declaring behind him. None of the canonical Gospels have that. All the canonical Gospels have are the natural eyewitness accounts of people who then report to the Gospel writers and so on and so forth. Again, read Richard Bauckham. But now when we're dealing with these, it's like, how are these connected? And so with Thiel, it's just connected with Antichrist. And in terms of approaching this from a historical grammatical context, it's like you could just throw 100 things at it. All right. But this is where neither Peterson nor Thiel really care. Because unlike me, who has been swimming, marinating, working, devoting myself to within a tradition, within the work of the church for all of my 62 years, I don't know just off the top of my head Thiel's relationship with Christianity growing up. Born in 67, he says that in the video. The church attendance was at a peak. I don't know. But one of the things that's interesting to me is the way that both Peterson and Thiel are appropriating the Bible with their own filters in their own ways. And I suspect that we'll continue to see this. And we've seen this before. You look at someone like Northrop Frye's, you can dig up his videos of dealing with the Bible, and you find these very, very brilliant people coming to the Bible in some ways not from a tradition. Now there's danger in that, but there's often sometimes newness in that. And so, again, what's interesting is that what Thiel and his interlocutor here in the Hoover Institute, a long-standing tradition of attention to a figure. Is it a figure? Is it a spirit? What is it? But if there's Christ, then there's Antichrist.
Close quote. There are people who take all of this seriously. We've already quoted René Girard. We've already quoted Cardinal Newman. But Daniel dates from the Iron Age. Thessalonians and Revelation are 2,000 years old. Contemporary society, we sit here in Stanford University.
So here we have a very smart man who has made billions of dollars. And I assume has thoughts on a great many things. Let me also say that billionaires get weird. First of all, in order to accumulate that amount of money in such a short amount of time, you have to be extraordinary. But Elon Musk, his lifestyle, his breeding program of children, his relationship with women, his in and out of government, in and out of this, in and out of that. Not normal. Bezos, the transformation of Bezos. Rogan was talking with someone else. Basically, Rogan was saying, you don't get that quickly unless you're, and Epstein, Bezos, Thiel. These are because it's not only that you have to be exceptional to make that kind of money. Once you make that kind of money, you no longer live like most of us live. You don't pump your own gas. You don't go to the grocery store. You don't go anywhere without your bodyguards and your security. You do things. You don't fly. I've just spent a lot of time on airplanes in the last couple of weeks. You don't sit cramped in the back of Southwest Airlines, and the very lovely gentleman gave up his seat so that an older couple could sit together. But all three of us were big in that row. And so I was happy to get a window seat so I could do a little bit of sleeping, but then I wanted to work on my sermon. I just had my little Microsoft Surface. I figure I can do something. It just got the tablet part on my lap. There's no way I already know I'm too big to use the cover, but I couldn't even move my arm to do anything with that. And it's like, all right, this is going to be hours on the airplane. No, didn't fly private.
contemporary society all but ignores these texts or derides them as of interest only to snake handlers, as I mentioned, snake handlers in Kentucky hollers. You are no snake handler.
Well,
You take this stuff.
not that I'm aware of. No.
Not that you're aware of, not that I'm aware of. So we'll come to how the Antichrist might arise, what we must do to prevent. We'll come to that in our second conversation. But the first thing I want to establish is, why do you take this seriously?
Well, again, one can take it seriously without taking it completely literally.
Mm-hmm.
But just let me maybe defend Daniel, the Old Testament prophet. And if you contrast it with, let's say, a Greco-Roman understanding of history, Thucydides, Herodotus. Thucydides writes the account of the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, and it has a timeless and eternal character. It's the rising power against the existing power. Athens is the rising power, and the Thucydides trap is when this repeats itself with Wilhelmine Germany against Britain in 1914, or perhaps today China against the U.S. It's timeless and eternal. The particulars don't matter. The speeches people give don't matter. Thucydides makes them up, and it's sort of like a natural, cyclical kind of a view of history, or one where there is no specific history. And then, by contrast, I do not think it's an exaggeration to say something like Daniel was the first historian, where it is the things that matter are one time and world historical. And
right there, pay attention to that. One time, world historical. He basically notes Chronos and Kairos, and he's saying, I'm Team Kairos. Lewis makes this point in Miracles and in other places that all of the postulations with respect to running statistics on history don't work, because history, by definition, is a series of one-time things. And events have consequences. I've been doing a ton of reading the late 19th, early 20th century on the start of the First World War. Those of you who've been following the channel for a while know that I've read a ton about the Second World War. And now I'm paying attention to the First World War, because you cannot understand the Second World War without understanding the First World War. And in many ways, even though the Second World War gets all of our attention, it's really the conclusion of the First World War. And you can't understand the United Nations and FDR's For Freedom speech without understanding Woodrow Wilson and the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 and the craziness that was, and the audacity that happens after that First World War of ideas like self-determination and remapping so much of the world, and ideas of nationalism and then, of course, at the end of the First World War, you have the collapse of the absolutists. You have the collapse of the Russian Empire, the collapse of the Austrian Empire. Before the First World War, the whole game was empire. Everybody wanted an empire, and Germany and Italy are last into the empire game, and so there's only little pieces of the world left that can sort of try to be picked up in order to patch their empire to compete with France and England and Russia. And of course, by the end of the Second World War, empire will be accomplished. You'll have the American empire, but the mode of empire is utterly different than it was with England and France and Spain and Russia. The mode of empire is radically transformed. But we still use that same word. But when we say the American empire, it looks different in terms of the Newtonian balcony and Alex O'Connor's little video camera. But yet we know that America's been running it. Of course, for a while it was the first world and the second world, and the Eastern Bloc, of course, falls. And, well, then now, of course, there's always got to be someone rising. So now the question is China and the Chinese empire. And the question is on what terms can we relate the Chinese empire to the American empire? And then you get into these questions of, well, what is the empire of Christ? And if there's anything that I talk about when I go through the Gospels, and after Advent, I'll be in the Gospels again in my sermons, and you will hear me again and again and again address the question of Messiah. Well, that's the Hebrew. Do you know what the Greek translation of Messiah is? It's Christ. It's about what a Messiah is. And I believe what the Gospels, all four of them, hammer down is this transformation in Messiah. But there's the Messiah that is Jesus Christ, and there's anti-Messiah. And David, when Jesus comes along, he comes along in the descendant of David, the house of David, the son of David. You have hosannas in the streets. But Jesus doesn't act like David acted. Jesus doesn't kick out the Romans like David handled the Philistines. Jesus doesn't subdue Arabia and Syria and Egypt the way David subdued Syria and Edom and Moab. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus says, my kingdom is not ek. Everybody wants to use the of. You can get from ek to of. Ek is the Greek. Of. Get from ek to of. But it's really much more from. My kingdom is not from this world. Well, what kingdoms are from this world? And so you have the question of Messiah and anti-Messiah and what Messiah is. And I think the four Gospels focus in on that immediately. And the rest of the New Testament tries to figure this out. And of course, the book of Revelation is an attempt to appropriate Exodus, Ezekiel, Isaiah, Daniel, this corpus of the law and the prophets, and understand them through the lens of Jesus Christ and round out the whole story.
There was a creation, there was a fall, there's a Mosaic revelation.
History is going someplace.
It's going somewhere, and the choices people make matter, and some of the choices matter in a very, very big way, and there's a way that Christ's ministry and death and resurrection was a part of history or a hinge moment of history, and then there are ways it continues, and I think that that's sort of a feel for history, and something like Hegel is just a pale shadow of the Judeo-Christian sense of history. You could say again, you have to qualify this very carefully, but you could say that the new.
Why would he say something so dismissive of Hegel, great Hegel? Because when you look at the trajectory of Western philosophy, Hegel is a really big deal. And Thiel says, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it's all very abstract. What makes history are events, are actions in the world. And again, go back to Peterson maps of meaning. There are two ways to approach the world. Say world is a place of objects, or world is a form for action. And Thiel comes in and basically says it's action, it's events, it's decision. But of course, you've got Peugeot that you have to understand that events, if you watch the rest of Vervaeke's lectures, events come from above. at least as much as these things, because we don't interact with these things unless there's this vertical causation. And again, if you finish watching Vervaeke's argument, you'll see that's where he finally gets, which is an amazing thing given all of the conversations where John Vervaeke started back 7 years ago, when the three of us began talking.
Testament God is the first progressive because the new supersedes the old. And so it's the first time that there is something new just by virtue of it being new. There's something new that comes in through history. You have to, all these ways you have to qualify it. If you go too progressive, you get to something like, Marcion or Marx. But if you say it's all in the Old Testament, that's somehow not quite right either.
Mm. So you take it seriously because you don't believe history is Groundhog Day. It doesn't happen over and over and over again, this cyclical aspect, the eternal recurrence, in some fundamental way, the meaninglessness of it. History is going someplace, and if it's going someplace, that means there will be an end point.
Now, psychologically, think about his life. PayPal. And if you read the Musk biography, the same guy who did the biography of Jobs, it's crazy how that whole thing worked. I mean, and then Facebook, and there's a fascinating book on the conspiracy of something I read the book, and it was absolutely fascinating on how he took down Gawker. And I think you don't appreciate Thiel. If you read that book, you'll appreciate how calculating he is. Because most people could not do what he did to take down Gawker. The level of discipline that required.
And there are important things that will happen that are different from things that happened in the past. And so if we want to have a feel for our times, for what is going on in the world in the early 21st century, there are ways we can try to reference it to the past. You could say there's some parallel between the decline of the United States and the fall of the Roman Empire. But the differences are surely really important. It's happening in a world of nuclear weapons and instantaneous communication, and it's happening in a very post-Christian or hyper-Christian world, not in a pagan world, and somehow the classical approaches to history always downplay the things that are one-time, unique, world historical, and I think we should take our bearings more from that.
Peter Thiel, thank you. Join us for part 2. This is a sentence I never thought I'd utter.
All right, then there's a second part. So
The inner and the outer are resonating. The vertical and the horizontal. I'm suggesting to you, that's spirit. So why is it incredible for you to think there might be a spirit of a city when you understand that there's a spirit of the billions of neurons in your brain and you call it me? What's the difference? Well, I'm the buffered self, and selfhood ends here. Below, within, okay, I can deal with that. But above or below, no, just here. People actually literally think the self is sort of right here, about 3 inches in. Get a sensed presence of our porous participation. It's not just an unconscious thing. See, what Dan Shappy and I argued, the work we did about the scientists and the rovers, is it's paradoxical because one of the rovers was called Spirit, right? They form, the scientists form a spirit, and that spirit can track hyper patterns that individual cognizers can't grasp. And now Eric Hole has showed that that's actually mathematically provable. But you remember, the brain is modeling itself to model the world, and as it models the world, it's modeling itself. And what can happen is that sense of you being, that processing that's imaginal, dialogical, porous participation, it can go from being, I'm going to do this, the glasses you look through, something you look at. And that's the work of Anderson Day and John Geiger and a whole bunch of other people in presence. And we now have to, this is going to be weird, and it needs to be weird, because weird is showing you that we're starting to break the dichotomies. The number of people that have sensed presence is way more than you realize. The number of people who hear voices and aren't psychotic or have mental health issues is large. And there's a continuum. Some people have a sensed presence and it's something just sitting beside my shoulder. Other people have like a Socratic daemon talking to them. And you think that's weird and strange, but pay attention to what's called parts work in IFS. Talking to the different sub-egoic parts of you is now the norm and becoming the dominant norm in psychotherapy. It's weird. Now, here's the thing that's encouraging. When you feel weird and creeped out, we know this because of psychedelic research and altered states of consciousness. Altered states are neither good nor bad. They're neutral. The best way to understand them is their states of epistemic vulnerability. Epistemic vulnerability. The buffered self is broken, you're vulnerable. Now that can go really bad, and that can go really good. It's a double-edged sword. The evolutionary basis for this is you get weirded out. You sometimes get sensed presence when you're weirded out, because what's happening is your brain is putting itself into an optimal state for the fastest, broadest learning it is capable of. And it's relying on the fact that you're inherently dialogical, transjective, and porous participation. And it's foregrounding your glasses because it's saying, you better update your glasses. And that can be a spirit talking to you. And what if we have a joint sensed presence that is reaching down to the primordial, reaching up to the ultimate, reaching from the archetypal to the paradigmatic, reaching into the sub-egoic aspects of my inner life, reaching out to the hyper patterns of reality, resonating them in a way that is reasonable, that is orienting me in a reciprocal opening, individually and collective, to a greater reality. So we're sharing a spirit that is imaginal and transjective, and for that reason is reasonable and real. And we can share it, and we can live it together. And it can unite our depths to our heights, and our innermost selves to our outermost aspirations.
And it can be good, and it can be bad. Just like what he said about the open. All right, I am out of time. I don't know what you think about this, but you can leave a comment.